Guess you lose some and win some. Long as the outcome is income.
Welcome back to episode 9 of the Outcome is Income podcast with your hosts Saif Dersey and Reese Booth. On today's episode, we are joined by none other than Mr. Scott Williams. For such a young entrepreneur, this man has already been through what some may only experience once in their lifetime, having successfully built and scaled and sold multiple businesses. His latest venture sees him enter the world of haulage and transport. Join us as we delve into how scarcity of resource creates mindset, materialism, and staying in your own lane, and the harsh reality of selling your baby. Scott, thank you very much for joining us on the Outcomes Income podcast. We're super excited to have you on and start unpacking your journey as an entrepreneur and a business owner. And I think that a really good place to start would sort of be your journey into entrepreneurship and owning a business and what those sort of first years looked like for you.
Yeah, so I've always sort of, I suppose, unconsciously been sort of into the whole realm of commerce. Through school, I sort of bought and sold sweets for the kids. Didn't really think anything of it at the time. It was just kind of one of those things. I wasn't like, oh, I want to be an entrepreneur, I want to be in business. It was just something that I did to earn a bit of pocket money, so I could obviously go and spend it on whatever I wanted. From that, I kind of, I suppose, were lucky in a way that I was exposed to things at such an early age and kind of exposed to a whole environment that allowed me to build a foundation that has obviously helped me along my way. And what I mean by that is primarily at the age of 18, I worked for a young developer at the time. He was 26, so I was 18, he was 26. He'd been very successful in telecoms and moved the money from telecoms into property. And I was kind of influenced by him in a positive way, because it was kind of one of those scenarios, where if he can do it, why can't I do it, so to speak? And there were other apprentices that worked for him as well, but however, they've kind of not gone down the entrepreneurial route. So evidently there was something within me that kind of wanted to choose that route in life. And I spent a lot of time picking his brain, seeing how he was doing things, trying to lift the rug on what exactly he was doing, so to speak, and I learned an incredible amount from him. So from that, I kind of had a taste of entrepreneurship and business, so to speak, from such an early age. And this was before you could go on Instagram or YouTube and pretty much everyone's talking about how to make money or how to be an entrepreneur or making 10 million quid before the age of 12 and all that sort of stuff. I was very much like literally Googling, how do you become a millionaire? And some of the stuff that came up was basically like, live below your means, invest, compound interest, make sure you don't drive a ridiculous car when you can't afford one. It was very basic stuff, but it kind of set me on this platform of understanding how I needed to build wealth and also how to sort of establish myself within business at the same time, really.
Yeah, I like that. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of, everyone at a young age always is the classic, how do I make money? And especially if you've come, not necessarily from a poor background, but just from a background where you've not had loads and loads of money as well. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that, every single entrepreneur has come from a place where they don't have money, but it's just scarcity of resource creates that mindset of, well, what can I do to make this money? So, yeah, and I guess that's why we have gambling, Scott, right? People gamble because they've got hope of being able to make that money quickly. But the reality is it's a whole long journey. Things take time and you're not just going to make it overnight. So, yeah, to talk us through kind of, because I know obviously you started off as an apprentice. So that's pretty good. And that's quite tangible for people and relatable for people, because to start off as an apprentice, you either don't get paid money or get paid quite a low salary, especially compared to sort of your minimum wages. But at the same time, it's not about the money, it's about the learning experience, right? And I think that's what business is all about as well. So that is that learning side of things. So talk to us about that. So transitioning from being an apprentice and then kind of getting into, if you want to call it property investing, because I know that was your kind of first stage, right?
Yeah, so as an apprentice, you're kind of new to the world and you don't really know left to right, but you think you do, and that throughout the journey is a matter of fact. Really, you tend to think you know more than you actually know, and then you look back and think, actually, I don't know a lot then. And obviously, from 18 to my age now, 26, it's been 8 years, and when I tell people that, they're almost like, wow, you've done a lot in 8 years, but actually I've crammed a lot into that period because I've dedicated a lot of time, resources, pretty much all my life towards this one objective, which is, grow businesses, be successful in my own terms, grow wealth, etc., etc. And to make that transition is a long process. And I kind of consider myself as quite a traditional entrepreneur, where I've kind of gone through all of the processes. I haven't landed on a business that has made me a millionaire overnight, and I'm flashing all that cash. I've really had to develop and build through these phases. And typically the way that it works, is you make 10,000, you understand how that works. You make 100,000, you understand how that works, and so on and so forth. And you can't bypass that process unless you fall within an industry that you get really lucky, the timing was right, all these sort of factors that or you win the lottery, obviously. But typically business owners that do get that level of success typically lose it just as quick. Whereas my journey is slow, really boring. In terms of my own expectations and my own sort of journey. But within that 8 years, I've made decisions that I've either propelled me forwards because I've worked hard in order to do that, or B, because I have been lucky in a way and I have met the right people at the right time. But that's only because I've put that work in and that dedication that the opportunities have arose, really. And as an apprentice, I was on £3.30 an hour. And to me, it wasn't about the salary. It was about the education. It was the experience. It was having access to that 26-year-old that was successful. And I was quite fortunate that actually I understood that at quite, at 18. It wasn't just, right, I need to make as much money as possible. Because typically a lot of my mates who were, had gone into railway, were based in Crewe, so there's big railway industry. They were on, 10 times what I was on. But because, and they're still doing that job now and on similar salaries, but because I understood what journey I was on, I had to make sacrifice, and lots of sacrifice, in order to develop myself as an individual. And one of my favorite quotes ever is, if you work hard on yourself, you'll make a fortune, and if you work hard at your job, you'll make a living. And that is something that I've always lived by, and that's Jim Rohn for reference. But yes, that's my ethos. I constantly have to work on myself, and then as I get better, I'm going to earn more money, and my businesses are going to be more successful because I am predominantly that individual that pushes that business.
Yeah, that's a really nice, it's a really nice way to put it. And I think also for a lot of people that do see, especially because we've got social media so prevalent these days as well, and success looks quite materialistic on social media. It is very materialistic on social media, and that's what people attribute to success. But actually, for me personally, and I know probably for Reese, and Reese will really relate to what you've just said, so I'll come on to him in a second. But I think for me, success is about doing what you've just done. It's learning, is gathering all the experience and the skill sets that if things do go wrong, because things can go wrong in business, in life in general, you can pick yourself back up and you can do something totally different and still make money and still succeed at it. So for me, you've just built your infrastructure before you're building everything else, whereas other people are looking to build everything else with no infrastructure, and that's why it's always very short-lived, as you said. But yeah, Reese, how do you relate to that as well?
I think pretty much every point, to be fair. It's a similar, young person's entrepreneurial journey, isn't it? So I can especially relate to where you, in those early stages where you're building, and like Safe said, you're building your infrastructure. It's always tempting to look at other people's grass and see how green it is, especially when you've got people going into well respected industries such as railway, where they might be starting on a decent salary, and you're in the process of building your business and you're bootstrapping everything, and you're trying to grow that baby and get it as big as possible. It's tough at the start. How did you sort of cope with that on a more of a personal level? Because I know that I have friends that started on they came out of university, got decent jobs, and then I've got other friends that are in a similar position to me where they're starting businesses and they're bootstrapping. How did you sort of deal with that difference? Was that sort of more ammunition for you to develop yourself further?
I'm absolutely 100%. I mean, for me, I just focused on staying in my own lane, and I'd be lying if I said I never came out of that lane and was, never influenced by what other people were doing and compared myself to other people in a way. But you always come back, or I always come back round to understanding that my mission is different to their mission, and that what they're doing is not an equivalent of what I'm doing, and the results that people have through social media, or whatever that may be, is because their circumstances and environment are completely different to mine. And if the way that I try and justify it in my own mind is, in the short term they may have nicer cars than me, a bigger asset back, whatever it may be. But I know over the long term, I'm going to either catch up with them or I'm going to get ahead of them because of the I suppose the time that I'm putting in now and the understanding that I'm developing. I know in the long term, I'm going to pretty much trump most people to a certain degree. Obviously not the Jeff Bezoses or Elon Musk, but they're different planet they are. So, but yeah, typically just try and focus on staying in my own lane, really.
That's a really good point, Scott. If any of the listeners, and even for yourself, if you've not listened to episode 3, we did episode 3 with a guy called Chirag Shah. Sorry, no, episode 4 with Chirag, and he talks about building a business as similar very much to building a house. So you need to build the footings in, the foundation first, before you start actually building the shell. And he said that's the part that no one wants to do, and that's where you need to be patient. And if you're patient enough, you can then build this nice, big, sexy house. But I guess people are building houses before they build the foundations in a way, and that's what business is about. The second point he said, and again, go back to episode 4 if you haven't, is he said people get too attached to their first business and they have fallen in love with their first business. And he said that's the biggest problem, is you've spent all this time and effort learning how to do the first business, so why get attached to it? Sell it, exit, do something, and then when you build the second and third and fourth, you've already got all the elements. So that was some really, really good points that kind of tie in there. So, Scott, tell us a bit about the transition period. So you transitioned from apprentice to property investor. What did that look like, and how did that form part of your journey as well?
Yeah, so I actually read a book, I think it's Millionaire Mindset, and in that book it primarily said, if you want to be in an industry, you need to work in the industry, you need to understand it, learn it. I think the example it gives is the guy that founded Starbucks. So I knew from obviously working for someone in property that property was a great vehicle to build wealth, generate wealth, etc., business. That was the main objective. So I focused my career on developing my experience and understanding of the property game by basically working within the industry. So I worked in letting agent, then I moved to sort of HMO lettings and more sort of sophisticated investing. And I was very fortunate again to basically message a local investor on LinkedIn just to say, I'm looking at, and I'd never heard of property sourcing before, never heard of anything like that. Basically, the guy that I used to work for said, if you find any sites, and I'll pay you a fee for it. So I messaged this guy on LinkedIn, local investor, and said, what do I do? How do I structure it? He basically said, come in, have a chat, and ended up working for him for a short while. And that's kind of when the floodgates opened for me, because I kind of thought the traditional way, you earn money, you save money, you invest it in property, and you do it again, rinse and repeat until you've got 10 properties and you're financially free. Little did I know, obviously, you could raise private finance, utilize that, refinance, buy, sell, all these smart, ways of basically being in property. I didn't know existed because I'd kind of not been on the social media. Property social media wasn't what it is today. There was no resources really out there. So I basically learned a lot from these individuals that were doing more sophisticated investing, and that was kind of the jump for me into, I suppose, being actually self-employed and being able to be in property. Because I thought, right, well, by the age of 25, I might have 10 properties, because the traditional way, I'll earn money, I'll, the slow way, basically. And obviously I got trained up. I invested a lot of money of what I saved in that period of time. So, I mean, I was working probably 60, 70, 80 hours a week to basically just save money. I'd basically built up a pot of about 25 grand that I thought I was going to buy property with. But I ended up spending some of that on my education to, develop my skills, so to speak. And then that's really when, floodgates opened. I understood, right, I need to raise finance, I need to find business partners, I need to find deals. And and that's kind of what led me up to meeting my former business partner. And then the next step was obviously buying the property.
Nice. And just a quick one as well, Scott. So when you saved up that first pot of money, you were working in the letting agent.
Yeah, so I had a
Yeah.
mixture of things that I was doing. So I was basically operating a gardening business. So that was Saturday, Sunday. And yeah, apologies to anyone that I did any work for because I was terrible. I was then doing EPCs as well. I was doing obviously working Monday to Friday, and then I was doing like photo booths at weddings. So I was working for someone else that was operating them. So I was doing that pretty much Friday night, Saturday night, obviously out gardening Saturday, Sunday. So pretty much had no life. So I didn't have time to compare myself to other people really because I was just so focused on doing what I was doing. And that in itself, despite the money that I earned, that in itself just created discipline. It created a work ethic. It created an ability to manage my finance at the time because it was all about saving money and cutting costs. So that foundation there was almost probably the most beneficial thing that I've done out of everything that's gone on in my career. And I've done obviously a lot of things. That is probably one of the most beneficial time periods in my whole career to date, really.
Yeah, because in
I
any
think it comes
entrepreneurial,
back.
yeah, sorry, go ahead, Reese.
I was just saying, I think that comes back to the foundation piece quite nicely because, like you said earlier, it's about putting yourself in that industry before you want to go into it, and that's, apart from the photo booth side of it, doing the landscaping and working in the letting agency is a really low barrier um to entry to start moving in the sector that you want to get into, which incidentally is property in this case. And I think there's some really key takeaways there for anybody listening here as well about, if you are looking to set up something in a particular spot where the low hanging fruit is, try and figure out where you can jump in, whether it's part time or on a full time basis, to understand the inner workings of that industry without taking any risk.
Yeah,
No,
and it's the
absolutely.
hustle phase, isn't it? Really. So you've gone through which any entrepreneurial journey starts with a bit of a hustle phase at the start. So you do as many things as wide as possible. You figure out what does work, what doesn't work, and then what does work, you then niche down on it, right? So sometimes being too niche too early is actually is quite a big mistake that people make. Some people have made it work in a very I'd say there's been certain circumstances where you can make it work, but generally speaking, it's being as wide as possible, trying as many different things, seeing what you do and don't like, what doesn't work, and then just trying to find your niche. So yeah, I really, really like that point. So we won't go kind of too in detail about that, but let's just say you kind of that's your property investing journey, and that's how it kind of started and it evolved. And I know you've now obviously built up your own portfolio. You built up a management company as well back then. So just talk us through a bit of that kind of side of things. So talk us through the business side of things. Obviously, you built up multiple businesses since then and have exited as well. So can you just tell us a bit about that? Because I know there's not loads of people in this day and world that have exited loads of business at that young age. But yeah, it would be really good for all the listeners to understand the reasoning behind why you as an individual wanted to exit and where you're going to go to next.
Yeah, I mean, for me, property, it was never really about property. It was always about business, and business for me is what kind of ignites that inner demon, so to speak. And I've always been conscious of the best way to generate wealth is basically you build something and then you sell it, whether it be property, whether it be a business, whether anything pretty much within a certain degree. And that for me is my journey, and that's what I know I will generate majority of my wealth from is by developing, building things and scaling them up, selling them, or buying something else, adding to it, putting them together, selling it. That's where my, I suppose, skill set as an entrepreneur really comes to light. And that's mainly probably through passion more so than anything. I'm not, for the record, through school I did average. I didn't do excellently well. I'm not unintelligent, but I'm not super intelligent. I'm kind of the middle ground. So you just need to have that level of passion towards business to make a success of it. But for me, I've kind of always been through the process of understanding, right, well, what opportunities are around me and how can I develop those opportunities to generate wealth or, a successful business. And obviously the letting agency, we had that because we were buying property, holding it, and we needed to manage it. That then evolved obviously from just being convenient that we're managing our own property to actually let's manage other people's property and earn a return from that infrastructure. that obviously developed and grew, and then we ended up selling that to the other business partner at the time, who was 50%. And on our side, we were 50%. We sold to them end of 21, because the direction of our existing or our core business had changed into financial services. So, another synergy sort of spin-off. And I am actually seeing quite a lot of investors now that are moving from property into financial services, because it is a natural progression really for that understanding, and more so from a client perspective. Obviously, being able to deliver the products is a completely different skill. So we saw an opportunity where we could actually get into financial services. And fortunately for us, our stepping stone was through the unregulated space, which you don't need any prior qualifications to get into commercial finance. It's all unregulated as long as you're lending to a limited company or an LLP. So we were fortunate that, we didn't need a degree, or we didn't need CMAP, or we didn't need all these qualifications. And that's great as an entrepreneur, because you can find a lot of information out by just doing and making sure you're doing a good job and working hard. You don't need a qualification to tell you that you're good at something or you're qualified, because, well, as you both know, that's just not the way that reality works. It's just a tick box exercise that regulators use to make sure that industries work well, which I completely get. But yeah, we kind of developed that business that we basically used someone else in the space that was doing lease finance for furniture. We thought, right, well, we can do this. It seems relatively straightforward. And that's where the kind of stepping stone started into the financial services. We quickly realized that actually we need to expand this business in a positive way, because it is scalable, it's sellable, it's scalable. It ticked all these boxes of long-term wealth generation, so to speak. So we bought into a mortgage business and basically brought everything together and expanded the commercial finance products, which basically turned the business from a self-employed business to an actual tangible business, probably in the space of about 3 months, where we went from two team members, both being directors, to, I think we topped out at 12 team, including the directors, within about 6 months. So we quickly scaled up. And do you know what? A lot of mistakes were made in that time, and but also a lot of lessons, and also a lot of wins at the same time. So, but because everything happened so quickly, and again, referring back to, I've only been doing it for 8 years, people are like, that's not a lot of time. But actually, you can cram a lot into that 8-year period. And truthfully, the first 4 years, 5 years has been incredibly slow. And not until I bought my first property at 22, just turning 23, did my career really start to evolve. And there's that phrase that, it's a millionaire, overnight millionaire, which is 100% true in most regards, because you do all this building foundation, the boring stuff that no one wants to do. And then all of a sudden, everything flicks into place. So yeah, we kind of grew that business. And I suppose fast forward to the back end of last year, the opportunity arose basically where the business partners could or were looking to potentially buy me out. And then the opportunity just arose for me, where my plan was always from the off that I was going to sell at some point, and that just came a little bit sooner than I was expecting. And the reason that I knew that was my objective from the off is because, again, what I've referred to is that is the best way to generate wealth. And I feel like I've got the business to a point where I've probably provided enough value for it to tick along as a really nice business. However, for me, my ambitions for a lot bigger businesses, it's financial services is really slow and boring, and you have to sort of generate business organically through referrals and marketing and that sort of stuff. Whereas my attention now is moving to a business where it's very quickly scalable through basically just reinvesting majority of the money. And that's why I jumped, or decided to jump, is because I needed an industry that was probably going to be a lot faster pace for what compared to the financial services. So the opportunity arose. I took the opportunity, and in a way, to kind of refer to your episode 4 podcast, there is an emotional side to me that is sad to see the back of the business, because it was my baby, and everything that, every dying breath was towards growing that business. And that was an emotional barrier that I'm fortunate enough I've got a bit of, well, I suppose I can switch off to that in a way, and I focus on the black and white, which is, well, this makes more sense from a business perspective, and this is the long-term objective. Does that align to it? Yes or no? And that's the answer. And I'm really sad that, you know, all the staff, I do miss them, and the directors as well. I get on with them really, really well. Probably call them best friends, if anything. So yeah, all that side of things was really difficult. But from a business perspective, and that is primarily what I'm in this for, it made sense to exit and to look at something else.
Wow. Yeah.
Wow. I think there's a hell of a lot to unpack there. I think there was one bit that really pricked my ears up, just moving back, Scott, and it was something that you said when it came to the start of that business, and the reason that you wanted to go down that route was because you perceived it as a very scalable business. But I think there could be a lot of value for anybody listening here to understand how did you identify that business as scalable? What did you look at to say, okay, this element of this business is scalable, and this is why I want to put resource into it? And then that moves on quite nicely into the next phase of that business, which was the acquisition. So you said you purchased then another piece of the puzzle to add and consolidate. So what were you sort of looking at in that business that made you say this is scalable? Like, what were the scalable parts?
Yeah, so that's to answer that very briefly, I suppose. It's a very broad question. There are a lot of metrics that do play into that understanding, so to speak. But I mean, to give the listeners insight, that my next step is into haulage and transport. And, you know, people might think, well, how do you go from financial services into haulage and transport? And I'll explain that now. So primarily when I looked at the industry, and I've looked at a lot of industries since selling my business, I looked at the industry and understood the size of the industry, and every year approximately about 770 billion goes through that industry, which is about 25% of the UK's GDP. So I already knew, right, well, the ceiling is 770 billion, and that's a pretty high ceiling in most regards. The second was, you know, understanding the barrier to entry and how simple or more difficult it is. And it's probably a medium barrier to entry. You need certain qualifications. You need to tick certain boxes. There is massive regulation in the industry. So it's not straightforward. People can't just go, right, I'm starting a haulage business, and they start one tomorrow. So in terms of competitiveness and people entering the market, it's not an easy barrier, but it's not a difficult barrier. So that's probably, I suppose, in terms of scalability, it's a reason, it's a half a tick for that. You know, the more difficult it is barrier to entry, obviously the better it is from competitor analysis perspective. And then the next stage was, right, understanding actually how do you scale this business from the perspective of generating business, and then also bringing people into that process. So at the minute, obviously, in 2021, there was a driver shortage, and then there was an increase in fuel prices. So the industry has gone through massive change recently over the last couple of years, which typically knocks people out of the industry for one, and also brings stimulation to an industry as well. So there's a lot more new drivers out there that have access to driving a wagon, so to speak. So again, another tick box there, because the industry's changed. So therefore, when I'm joining the industry, I'm understanding it from the new perspective rather than the old perspective, which probably gives me a slight edge against the older people that have been in the industry for years. And then secondly, it's understanding, right, okay, how do I scale this business from the perspective of growing the staff, growing how many wagons we've got on the road? And quite simply, it's, if you earn money, you can reinvest that into more wagons or more marketing and growing the business. And then the biggest tick box that you need to understand from a scalability perspective is how easy is it to outsource the work to employees or staff, or with any regards to that, how quickly can I bring in a team that I can then step backwards from, and then nurture that team and nurture the business in order for it to grow and scale. Once you understand that, and once you get that, then that gives you scalability, because if I'm not in the business on a day-to-day basis, and I've got a team that are out on the road and organizing those loads, and I don't really need to operate in it, then that's when you've got a sellable business, because you can primarily then give that to someone and say, here it is off the shelf, and they can operate it as usual because the team is in place to do so. And also to add to that, you can also acquire other businesses that are in that position to add into your business in order to make that business, a better EBITDA and get a better multiplier, which works on most industries. The higher your turnover, the bigger your multiplier is on your EBITDA. So there's smart ways to scale the business by just adding other businesses to it. And some people do that and they IPO, or they sell to other private equity. That there's so many options with it, and that's typically the best way to understand how scalable the business is. It's typically how much you can outsource and also how much you can add to it in terms of value from potentially other businesses or other processes or software, etc., etc.
If we can just take it one step back as well, Scott. So that's the scalability of this new haulage business. So this is where you're going to go to next, right? That's your next step. I think one thing that Reese wanted to understand as well was when you're in the management business and you were going to financial services, you obviously had your hat on there in terms of this is scalable as well. So what did you look at from that point of view at that time? If you had to snapshot, what did you look at in terms of financial services that made you think this is scalable at that specific moment? And then also made you want to do the acquisition within that. Obviously, you acquired part of a business, because that's exactly what you're now going to model into haulage. But it just sounds like haulage is more scalable than financial services, right?
Yeah, definitely. So that the acquisition side, that's a big that was the major reasoning behind the scalability. Because if you take, let's say you're a brokerage of 10 and you acquire another brokerage of 10, then all of a sudden you've got a brokerage that's 20, and typically your turnover should be way over £1 million at that mark. And then from that point, you can acquire a brokerage of 20 or another 10, and you've got 30. And I think that's the only real way to scale a financial services business, unless you are willing to grind it out for the next 10, 20 years, where you'll get organic growth and scalability. Because typically people need money, and they're always going to need money, and there's always a market for it, and it's not an easy industry to get into, because you need qualifications. So that was kind of the big tick box. It was the acquisition side that really kind of made the business so scalable. And there are thousands of brokerages out there, whether it be commercial finance, mortgages. So again, that was a massive tick box, because the opportunities were out there. But the biggest thing to that is you need to find other businesses that don't rely on a director. And that's where the real value comes in. Because if you buy a self-employed mortgage broker and their book of business, you're not really buying a business, you're buying their contacts, and there is no real value in that. Maybe you might get a 50% hit rate on people that do come across, but typically you want to be looking at businesses where there is probably 4 members of staff upwards that are earning income, not admin staff that are earning income. That's probably where the real value for acquisition comes in. And typically you're going to pay a premium for that, because people's business valuations are often not where they should be. But obviously that's the same as property. It comes down to negotiation and obviously getting the best price.
Yeah, I think there's one sort of little nudge along further that I'd like to just hear your perspective on, Scott, as well, is where you've sort of been involved in those acquisitions. How did you sort of look to structure them? Was it sort of from profits that the business generated, or were you looking at sort of clever ways to acquire these businesses? If you don't mind sharing some of that, I'm not saying speaking, what you did, but how would you sort of go about those decisions?
Yeah, so when we acquired the mortgage brokerage, we were fortunate. I say we because it was myself and a business partner. We were fortunate that because we'd made money in property and we ended up selling a couple of properties before we went into lockdown, and we were kind of sat on a bit of cash. We were fortunate that we just paid cash for the shares. However, on my exit of the business, it's completely different. So I've had 50% up front, which is all boxed off, and over the next 12 months I'll be paid the remainder of that amount stretched over that 12-month period. So I'm basically on an earn out, which is what it's referred to, for the next 12 months. Non-compete, earn out, and then after that 12 months I'm basically free to either get back into the industry, which I probably won't, and also obviously my earn out stops at that point as well.
Yeah. So it's giving you a bit of an income,
Yeah,
which
brilliant.
which is pretty good, plus a lump sum. And one thing that no one ever talks about, although I have heard, I think it's Nick Jenkinson when he sold Moonpig talk about it, is what was that feeling like when you sold the business? Like, what did it feel like? Because not many people have sold business, as I said, so it would be good to get an insight as to the only thing that I've got is when we sold the HMO and closed off all the utilities. I remember that feeling, and that was a great one. But what was the feeling like when you sold the business?
It is really mixed emotions, to be fair. Obviously it's nice to see the money come into the bank. That's obviously, a great feeling. But then the reality sets in of like, now what's next, so to speak. And it almost feel, and this is strange because obviously nothing's really changed in terms of the real world scenario, but you almost feel like you're out in the world again, in like this real world, not Amplo world, which obviously was the business that I sold, but the real world again. And what am I going to do? And obviously, the biggest thing, my biggest fear, I suppose, is kind of losing momentum in a way and getting lazy and not continuing to push, because your career is a constant thing. It's not just because I've sold a business I'm going to stop and retire now, because that's not the mission that I'm on. It's all about keeping the momentum going. So yeah, a mixed emotion, happiness, fearful, sad, obviously leaving the staff. That it was pretty much every emotion you could imagine. But you've just got to try and push forward, I guess. That's the best thing you can do in most
Yeah.
regards.
I think when Nick Jenkinson sold Moonpig, it was a couple of hundred million. And he said, put his helmet on, cycled back home as you do in London, and I think he said he popped a bottle of champagne and then just went to bed that night. Like, is it, it's like another normal day. But yeah, it's interesting because obviously you don't get that insight. So yeah, thanks for that. And one thing that I was going to kind of touch up on as well, which is what you talked a lot about, is your journey. If we look back and map it out, you went from apprentice coming out of school, and then you basically learned quite a lot from being an apprentice. You then essentially worked and hustled, let's call it. So you hustled in various different jobs, various different things that you did in a self-employed way, weekends, weekdays. Then you did a bit of property investing, although property investing is never on its own. There's always those other bits with it as well. Then you started a management business, and then you exited. Then you started a financial services business. Then you acquired a financial services business. Then you exited. And now you're going to go on, hopefully, create a haulage business. But the amazing thing that everyone needs to understand about that whole timeline is, although there's been ups and downs to get you there, you've basically gone up in quite a linear fashion. So you've gone from sort of starting here and finishing there, if you see what I mean. And I think that's what's amazing about business is, the best saying in business for me is, you need to be in business to get into business. So if you don't start, you can sit and procrastinate all you want. What am I going to do? What's my business plan going to look like? All of this stuff. But the reality is, unless you start, you don't know where it's going to take you, and it always takes you places. So that's really, really cool for people listening, just to kind of see that insight, especially from your 18 to 26-year-old sort of journey, I guess. But yeah, is there anything that you would have changed at all in that whole journey, if you could?
Nothing, absolutely nothing. I think the process is the process, and my process is my process. And without going through what I've been through in every scenario, whether it be positive or negative or just another boring day, that was where I was meant to be at that one time. And I think the biggest thing with entrepreneurship business is you almost can't have emotions towards things that do happen and don't happen, because if you focus so much on the what ifs and the changes and the regrets and blah blah blah, you're just wasting time. Basically, you're wasting energy, time, headspace, because you're focusing on the wrong stuff. For me, I only focus on all the great lessons that I've learned, and also the fact that I am now in a position, both mentally and physically, by going to the gym and keeping on top of reading, blah, 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 in a great place that, I think if 18-year-old Scott, you said, right, you're out in the real world, go and start a business, I'd be like, I don't know what I'm doing. Whereas now, I haven't even deliberated on the fact that what I'm doing next, I've just gone, right, well, that looks like a good business. I'm going for that. I'm not thinking, oh, well, what if it doesn't go wrong? What if I don't pass my qualifications? What if I don't get an operator's license? What if I don't do all this stuff? I'm not focused on that. I'm focused on what I need to do in order to get where I need to get to and deliver on what I need to do in order to generate the business that, I'm probably hopefully going to go on to do. And a lot of people starting out focus on all the stuff that can go wrong and then get so overwhelmed that they never start. Whereas, and people ask me all the time, an example would be, should I do flips or should I do HMOs? Well, it doesn't matter what you do because they both work. It's just about going out there and doing either. And if you find a flip before you find a HMO, then do a flip. Don't just do a flip. Don't not do a flip because you want to do HMOs, and vice versa. Whereas people get so fixated on, oh, well, what should I do? What's the right way to go? Well, the right way to go is just move forwards, ask the questions, and figure out the answers to questions that you potentially have yourself. And that's the best way to learn, because worst case scenario, you get nowhere, but you've got a load of information that you can actually utilize further down the road. And that's typically why people never get started, is because they're trying to get this perfect scenario that doesn't exist anyway. Because I mean, obviously I've exited, that's quite good, but actually it's not a perfect scenario because I'm not happy, I'm not content, it's not what I want to do, it's not my end goal. So, people be like, well, exit in a business and on an earn out for 12 months, you can retire. Well, no, because I'll be unhappy. So there's never a perfect scenario. It's just about getting started and moving forwards.
Yeah, I love that. I think there was one other thing that I wanted to ask in relation to that sort of start and finish point of the journey, because I think, Scott, you're in quite a unique position at the moment where you've obviously have a lot of experience in sort of starting, building, scaling and exiting businesses. But with what you know now, so now we obviously understand that you're going to go into the haulage space. With what you know now, what would be your decision making around buying an established haulage business to scale versus starting from zero again? How has that thought process gone through your head, and where are you at the moment with that?
Yeah, so it's a really good question, to be fair. And I have thought about both options. And for me, although I like to take risk, I'm quite risk averse at the same time, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but hopefully it makes sense to people. And actually, I'm starting from zero because what I want to do is understand actually every single mechanic that goes into starting a haulage business and operating a successful haulage business. Once I've potentially got one or two wagons, or maybe three, that's when I'll start to look at acquisitions, because I've got that foundation, the boring period, that everyone talks about and doesn't want to do. It's because I've got that foundation and understanding to go, right, well, I've done three, I can now do 30, 40, 50, because typically the more you scale, obviously you just need more people and a bigger team. And typically you can start to really ramp things up then. Obviously the risk goes up at that point, the financials, all this sort of stuff. But yeah, I'm starting ground zero because I want to understand the business from the bottom end first. And you know what? I probably will go and work for a HGV firm, and probably will jump on a wagon to get that understanding. So, if anyone does give me any jip, one of the drivers, I can say, well, I've been there, I've done that, and I know you're taking the pick. So yeah, that's, and you know what, that is really boring, and I'll hold my hands up and say, and that's probably why I at the start of this podcast I said, I'm quite a traditional entrepreneur, that I want to follow the process and I do want to do things in the right way, and I don't want to cut corners, because I know cutting corners in the long term, it never works out. So you might as well try and follow the process the best you can in order to get the best outcome, which is typically a really good business that you can sell. And that's the reality of any process. You can't just bypass that unless you are like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or someone like that just have got it, like beyond got it.
The unicorns, the unicorns of the world, which, let's be honest, there's not that many of them anymore, and I don't think they're that easy to be able to kind of go out and do. So it's easy to kind of just start and, like I said, do the boring part of the hard work, the building of the foundation, because there's no silver bullet, unfortunately. So look, Scott, I think we could be here all day, in all honesty. There's so much I want to unpack, and we say this to a few guests, that sometimes, maybe there's a part two at some point, once maybe you started that haulage or you started in that. So I think there's definitely going to be a part two to this, hopefully. But look, and there was already so many answers to this question that I'm going to ask you, but we ask the question on every single podcast at the end of it is, the podcast is called The Outcome is Income. So what's one tangible piece of advice that you can give to listeners today to basically, to help them to create that outcome of income?
Yeah, so the biggest, I mean, and I've said it already, I have referred to it. The biggest thing is you need to work on yourself. You need to focus on developing your skill sets in order to generate wealth. So, to put that into context, I could make probably 2-3 grand a month comfortably by just the contacts that I've got and doing certain things that I know would generate money. I wouldn't have been able to do that when I was 18 because I didn't have the contacts, didn't have the skill set. But that's not because I've got an incredible business, or my parents have got it, all this. It's because I've got that skill set. No one can take that away from me, no matter what. I've always got that skill set now. So that in itself should be people's focus, because the way it works is the more value you add to an economy or a business, the more money you're typically going to get. That it's literally that straightforward, and it's really boring and it's really slow, but that is the process.
Amazing. That's a really, really good answer. And also that translates to people that are going for a job interview, writing a CV, doing all this, that, and the other. I could do this, I do that, this is, whereas why can't you go in there and say, look, this is what I can do for your business. This is how much value I can add to your business, and show them that tangibly in terms of numbers. I can increase your turnover by this much. I can help profitability because I can consolidate a lot of things by this much. So I think that creates something tangible, and I would say 99 times out of 100, you will get hired regardless of what actual technical skill sets you have, just by going in there with that kind of attitude and speaking to people, whether it's a business that you want to become part of, or whether it's something that you want to, start and basically scale. So yeah, Scott, we've, really, really enjoyed this podcast, as I said, and for anyone sort of listening to this, anyone that wants to reach out, maybe they've got a haulage business, maybe they've got some kind of business, and they want to kind of reach out for various opportunities, or maybe just want to sort of speak to you and inspired by your journey, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Yeah, best way is Instagram. So I've got a specific business account, so it's Scott Williams Business. I don't really post on there that much. I'm not a massive social media person. I used to be, but I'm not anymore. It doesn't align to the business objectives. But yeah, you can reach out to me on there.
Okay, brilliant stuff. Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks for your time.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Oh, what an episode. Shout out Scott for jumping on with us. I personally took away absolutely loads from this conversation, and I know that all of our listeners are going to find this so valuable. If you guys did enjoy this episode, then definitely be sure to check out episode number 4, where we had a really similar, amazing conversation with another serial entrepreneur by the name of Chirag Sar. If you guys also liked this episode, please share it with your friends and family. Let us know what you think, and we'll catch you in the next one.